Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's discussion. My name is Jen Pauliukonis. I'm the Director of Policy and Programming at the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. And we're all here because while the nation's attention has been on the tragedy impact of the COVID pandemic for the last 18 months, another preventable deadly epidemic has been raging: gun violence. The increase of shootings in communities across the nation has highlighted this horrific public health crisis and the inherent inequities in our systems and our country. We extend our deepest sympathy to everyone who is grieving and to those who have been impacted by gun violence. It is my absolute honor today to introduce Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, who knows the impact of these kinds of tragedies too well. Long dedicated to the gun violence prevention movement and a tireless worker to implement life-saving measures in his home state and beyond, Senator Blumenthal offered to provide opening remarks tonight on the current landscape in Washington and how state-level advocacy is necessary to achieve sweeping national change. So Senator Blumenthal, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you to the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence for this very significant and informative session. I want to thank the panel members, Rebecca Fisher and Shana Harrison, and the New York group that has fought so valiantly against gun violence. And you're absolutely right, Jen, that this epidemic preceded the pandemic. The epidemic of gun violence, in fact, has been aggravated by it. We're seeing more shootings in Hartford and New Haven and other big cities in Connecticut, but in all communities. And we're seeing more gun sales, more stolen and missing guns on the streets, more transferred in the iron pipeline from states where the gun laws are weak to other states like New York and Connecticut where they are strong. In fact, we are at the mercy of states with the weakest laws. And that's why even states like Connecticut and New York with some of the strongest laws have a stake in the federal laws that we have been championing. So thank you to the coalition for being a champion. And I think we are really at the dawn of a new era because we've put together a grassroots movement, and you in the coalition epitomize it. It's a grassroots driven movement, a political movement that is electing members of Congress and even members of the United States Senate, as well as other officials. The President of the United States campaigned on this issue. Really, the first time in a generation, and also the first time in a generation that an administration has taken action administratively on ghost guns, on red flag statutes. And so we're making progress at the federal level, but let me be very blunt. It's way too little and too slow because we are blocked by, let me just say it, some of the states, some of the congressional districts on a partisan basis that we need to overcome. And we are going to overcome it, which is why I've held hearings in the Judiciary Committee, the Subcommittee on the Constitution, on red flag emergency risk orders, on safe storage measures, on the kinds of measures that states like Connecticut and New York have adopted. But here is, I think, what's important about the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence and its state and local leaders' initiative. The main progress really is coming from the states and municipalities. Not only is the grassroots pressure for better laws at the federal level coming from those community-driven organizations, but progress is being made there even more than at the state level. For example, on red flag statutes, 20 states now have emergency risk orders. Connecticut was the first state. There are now 19 more, both Republican and Democrat. On background checks, progress has been made in states like Connecticut and New York. On community intervention against gun violence. Again, Connecticut, just yesterday, the governor signed a bill that will allow Medicaid and Medicare funds to be used for community intervention because it really is a public health issue. And right. Of course, we hope for more progress at the state and local level, which is why your initiative is so very important. I want to give a shout out to Josh Horowitz, who came to testify at one of those hearings that we held in the subcommittee on constitutional rights. He testified on emergency risk orders, red flag statute, but the combination of background checks, emergency risk orders, safe storage, Ethan's Law in Connecticut, as it's known after Ethan Song, who perished at a friend's home because of a shooting with a gun. Was a teenager, and he and another friend were playing with it. We know this goes on all over the country. And of course, suicide, prevention, and treatment of people who may be susceptible to it. All of it is happening at the state level as a result of the perseverance and courage of state leaders. So my thanks to all who are taking action at the tip of the spear. We are winning this battle because people are realizing that our Congress is blocking measures that the American people overwhelmingly want. 80%, 90% want these measures by every metric. Even gun owners really believe, once they understand the reasons and the exact provisions, that these measures are necessary. So as we hopefully are recovering from the COVID pandemic, let's make sure that we continue to take action and initiative against an epidemic that is simply aggravated and highlighted by it, and make sure that we continue the initiative at state and local levels, and it will help us at the federal level to achieve more. Thank you so much to everyone, and thanks for including me on this call.
Thank you so much, Senator. It's so important, that you understand and you're sharing with everyone today how important federal and state advocacy work complement one another and how important that is. We're grateful for your time. I know you have a really tight schedule, so we will let you get back to upholding democracy for all of that. We're so appreciative of what you do. And then we are going to continue our conversation with Rebecca and Shana.
Thanks so much. We have votes. Otherwise, I would stay on the line, but literally, we have a vote coming up in just a few minutes. And I really want to thank all of you at the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence for the great work that you're doing. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good luck tonight.
Thank you.
So, as we all know, mass shootings make headlines. And it's important to know that there are scores more impacted by community gun violence, domestic gun violence, gun suicide. About 10 days ago, there was a shooting outside of National Stadium. It made headlines. And in another DC neighborhood, not far away, a 6-year-old girl had just been shot and killed. And this is the kind of tragedy that should bring a country to its knees. And it barely made a blip because we experienced over 100 gun deaths a day. Now, the uptick of shootings that we've seen over the last couple of years demonstrate that there are still huge gaps that exist in current legislation and community programs, and we clearly need to do more. For those of you who are watching tonight and not familiar with us, the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence was founded in 1974, and we work with our affiliate organization, the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence. And we've been using the public health and equity lens to identify and implement evidence-based policy solutions and programs to reduce gun violence in all its forms. And after years of research and advocacy, we found a really important truth, that the path to ending the gun violence epidemic is going to be achieved at the state level, and that we actually need to make America safer state by state. And that's why we created our new Safer States Initiative. It's a program that was started with the help of an anonymous donor. And we partner with organizations like New Yorkers Against Gun Violence, who I'm so appreciative who have come today so that we can talk about their work. They are a leader not only in their legislative advocacy, but their education program Reaction, which focuses on youth and impacted communities. Now, New York has had an unfortunate historic struggle with gun violence, but they also have a willingness of state and city leaders to address the issues in places that places the state in a unique position to make really important progress and to model innovative and evidence-informed policies and programs for states all across the country. At the coalition, we're expanding our efforts in New York by supporting and partnering with New Yorkers Against Gun Violence through our Safer States initiative to help increase their capacity and their voice in all corners of New York State. Now, before we start tonight with our discussion, which I'm so excited to be able to do, I just want to take a moment to invite all of the guests and participants tonight to submit any questions that you may have for Shana and Rebecca in the Q&A submission box, and it's located at the bottom of your screen. So we're excited to discuss the details of a path to progress with our guests, and I'm excited tonight to introduce Rebecca Fisher, who has served as the Executive Director of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence and the New Yorkers Against Gun Violence Education Fund for 4 years. Under her leadership, New Yorkers Against Gun Violence has strengthened its financial position, expanded its school-based program, increased membership, raised its public profile, and welcomed Youth Over Guns as its youth advocacy arm. I'm also pleased to welcome Shana Harrison, the Director of Education. Shana has designed, developed, and led New Yorker Against Gun Violence's Educational Fund's anti-gun violence program for youth, the Reaction Youth Education Program, since it was first launched over a decade ago. Since then, she's taught Reaction to over 3,000 students, engaged youth and communities across New York City and throughout New York State, trained new facilitators within the New York City crisis management system, influenced a generation of anti-gun violence advocates, and has emerged as a widely recognized and respected movement leader. And if you all on the call want to learn a little bit more about Shana and Rebecca and New Yorkers Against Gun Violence, we are actually going to put a link in the chat to an amazing article from the New Yorker earlier this year. It's a powerful description of the great work that this team has been doing. They're really on the forefront of innovative policy, racial equity, and programming. So thank you both for being here today. I would actually really love, I think our participants would love to hear why you chose to become active in the movement and why advocacy for better gun violence prevention policies is essential.
So, hi, Jen. Thank you so much for having us here. It's also a privilege to be here with Senator Blumenthal, and really has been a wonderful experience at partnering with the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. So thank you for having us. As Jen said, I'm Rebecca Fisher. I'm the Executive Director of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence and New Yorkers Against Gun Violence Education Fund. And I think it is an important question always for those who are working professionally in this field to discuss why we came to it. And the reality is that my story is not that dissimilar from many activists who work professionally in this field. I was affected, or a friend of mine was affected directly by a gun violence tragedy. And I think that that's both inspiring to many and also part of the issue in that a lot of us only come to this when we're actually affected directly by gun violence. My story is that I was practicing law in 2012. I have a law degree and I'm a lawyer. And I had never really been involved in gun violence prevention work. And I was at work one day in December of 2012, and I got an email from our office administrator that one of my colleagues who I'd worked with for 6 years, that her son was at school and there had been a shooting. And that shooting was the Sandy Hook tragedy. Of course, at the time, no one really knew anything about it. I immediately started texting with my colleague, soon learned that her son had survived, but was across the hall and had been hiding under his desk when the shooting took place. That tragedy deeply affected my friend and her community, and also inspired me to get more involved in the work at a time where I really, frankly, didn't think that I had time to do volunteer work. I just felt compelled like I had to do something. And so initially, I really only started volunteering my time as a lawyer and working on advocacy initiatives. And that's how I found New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. But when I got more involved in New Yorkers Against Gun Violence and joined our board, that was when I had the opportunity to actually go visit our education program and Shana in New York City public schools. And it really wasn't until I saw Shana teach and heard from young people in New York City that are affected by gun violence on a day-to-day basis, and learn more about the gun violence that's affecting marginalized communities of color every single day that does not get the national headlines, like the mass shootings that we learn about, that I decided that I wanted to pivot entirely and become a professional in this field. And it truly has been an honor and privilege of my lifetime to partner with Shana Harrison, who's been in this field and in this movement for far longer than I have, to learn from her. She is a mentor to me, and a friend. And so I actually would like to hand it off to her because I think you need to hear about how she came to this work.
Thank you so much for that, Rebecca, and also thank you so much, Jen, for having us. Again, my name is Shana Harrison. I'm the Education Director for New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. I've been working with this organization for well over 10 years. It's definitely a home for me. And I just think about, how did I start working with NYAGV? And I really think it has a lot to do with the kind of atmosphere and that we create with our education program. I initially was working with another nonprofit organization doing some mediation work in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, when I was asked to come and speak, at a forum that New Yorkers Against Gun Violence had created. It was really for young people who were disproportionately affected by gun violence. And we had an opportunity to create a list of recommendations for elected officials on what they could actually do to reduce gun violence. And I'm gonna be honest with you, just like any other 19-year-old person, I didn't want to do that. But it was something that they asked me to do, and it was a job, and I had to do it. So I did. And I really felt like my life changed in that moment, because when I got to that space, there was a bunch of elected officials who have been doing this work for so long, sitting there, listening to young people who have lived experience when it comes to gun violence. I've never really felt that before. I've never been in a space where I felt like my voice mattered in that way. And it was extremely empowering to be able to have a conversation with people that I thought at the time could actually help make my community safer. And I really felt like I needed to do something to make sure that other young people who looked like me, who came from my communities, had that same experience, that same chance. So, for me, working with New Yorkers Against Gun Violence was like a no-brainer. It was just like, hey, I know so many other young people who really want to do this work, but no one's given them the platform to do it. And New Yorkers Against Gun Violence is one of those organizations that said, hey, they really believed in youth-led work. They really believed in young people's voices. So that's how I started working on gun violence prevention.
Thank you both. Just listening to you is so inspiring. Now, I would like to dig into a little bit more of that work and what it's like. We do know that the most up-to-date CDC data, shows that New York actually has some of the second lowest gun deaths in the nation. But the last 2 years have really shown escalations of firearm homicide, especially in some hard-hit areas like Rochester and Buffalo in New York. And like many public health issues, there are drastic racial disparities. Young Black males in New York aged 15 to 34 actually have firearm homicide rates 30 times those of white males in the same age group. And we know that no one law is going to fix all of this, right? I think if that was true, New York would have 0 gun deaths. And that's why we need a comprehensive approach to this that includes programming and includes legislation. And so, Rebecca, it was a pretty accomplished legislative session, I know, and I wonder if you can talk about that, with those who are here tonight with us, and tell them just some of the highlights of the past legislative session.
Absolutely. So I was thinking that I could actually share a little bit of a presentation to make this a little bit more visual for our audience. So just bear with me for a minute. All right, so can everyone see this presentation? It looks like it's shared properly. Okay, so as Jen mentioned, part of our work is in the area of advocacy. We lobby for gun violence prevention measures at the state, local, and federal levels, but primarily our work is local, and we've been working on state legislation for over 25 years. And we were instrumental in the passage of the New York SAFE Act, and some of the other the other legislation that passed after the midterm elections, and we were able to flip the New York State Senate, including our red flag law. But we have been working hard at additional measures in the past year, and I think it's really essential that we walk through some of what those priorities were. First of all, here's our agenda. You can see what we worked on in the past session, and I'm very excited to say that a majority of our state legislative priorities have passed, and two have actually been signed by the governor. So let's first just quickly talk about what we worked on as a part of the New York State budget. The session budget runs from January to March, and that's really where we focus on funding. And our state legislators, State Senator Zelnor Myrie in particular, was a leader on this issue in fighting for more funding for community-based violence intervention and prevention work and hospital intervention and prevention work. And one of the reasons that it's so essential that we fight for funding is because there are evidence-based programs that are working on the ground that are community-led to interrupt the violence that's happening and that need more resources. And our government agencies at the state, federal, and city levels can be doing more to provide resources for those community programs, especially in a place like New York, where, as Jen mentioned, we have some of the strongest gun regulations in the country, but over 70% of the crime guns that are recovered in New York State are from out of state. And as Senator Blumenthal mentioned, until we are able to enact federal legislation across the board that looks like New York State's laws and Connecticut's laws, we need to be doing more to support communities that are disproportionately impacted by gun violence. So we were able to get this funding passed, and already some of that money has been distributed and is helping community-based organizations on the ground. The other law that we pushed hard for and was recently signed by the governor is a law that will creates a right to sue the gun manufacturers and reckless gun dealers. And again, another reason why this is so essential is because, as I said, the majority of guns that are used in crimes and are impacting New Yorkers are from out of state. So we really need to be able to go to the source of those guns. And far too often, the solutions that we focus on are really have an impact on the perpetrators who are on the ground, who may be the last to pick up the gun. And that is a problem because those laws and those penalties tend to have an impact on communities of color, while the gun industry and those creating these guns and fueling the iron pipeline are immune from any liability or from criminal conviction. And so this law will actually allow us to bring lawsuits and will be used as a model for other states. And I know that most recently, as a part of President Biden's announcement for some of his executive actions, he's actually interested in convening a committee of state legislators who are working on legislation like New York's. So we're very excited about that. Also, we were able to pass a state law to ban ghost guns, which Senator Blumenthal mentioned is become an increasingly large issue, especially during the pandemic. There has been a lot of homemade ghost guns made, in people's homes, and is the gun of choice for extremists, which is increasingly an issue. And so, again, New York has been a model on this issue as well, and we're looking to the governor to sign those bills, hopefully by the end of the summer. You can see that we're also still working on microstamping technology, and we're working side by side the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, which really has a deep bench of policy experts in this field, and that will be a priority in the 2022 session. So those are just a few of our legislative priorities. Certainly, if anyone has any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I'm wondering if the both of you could talk a little bit more about the coalition building surrounding this work. And Shana, I know for you, a majority of the work that you do is on your education program, but I'm also, pretty sure that you're having big impact on the policy work as well. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about that experience, especially, on your youth programming and the coalition building and the engagement that you do surrounding policy.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think it's really, I think the great thing about New Yorkers Against Gun Violence is that we do a lot of work on the advocacy side, but we also do a lot of work in schools and work with young people on the ground. But the work that we do in schools and on the ground definitely reflect, our legislative agenda. And I think that a lot of times that doesn't look like that in a lot of other organizations, right? So for us, a lot of the young people's lived experiences are part of our legislative agenda. We understand that some legislation that other nonprofit organizations might support, we might not necessarily get, back, because we understand it might have a negative effect on the young people or the community that we actually service. So I think, it's really, really important for us to not only teach young people how to advocate for their communities and themselves, but to really understand who represents them, and once they understand who represents them, also understand what kind of legislation that could actually make their community safer. So, for us, it's really important for us to understand that the majority, the people who are disproportionately affected by COVID-19 are the same young people who are disproportionately affected by gun violence. So when we see gun violence, rates rising, and we see those are the same places where the COVID cases are rising, we understand that right now more than ever is a time for legislation like this to pass. There's so much access to guns right now in these communities, but they don't necessarily have the same access to jobs or safe places to hang out, or summer youth programming, libraries, things like that. So it's really important right now for young folks to be able to advocate for some of the legislation that we just talked about today as an answer to a lot of the problems that they're seeing in their communities.
And Jen, I just wanted to add on to that, perhaps even more specifically, that we are a really small organization, and that has its challenges because we're frequently spread thin and we need more resources. But as a result, we have a very tight team. And although, my work frequently focuses on policy, and I have the law background, and Shayna is our director of education and runs our education program, we are constantly talking to each other about the work that we're doing on both sides and consulting each other about how, our initiatives affect the others. And I always go to not only Shayna, but our young people and other members of our staff before we select our policy priorities for each session to get their input, because it really shouldn't just be lawyers and policy experts who are creating new laws. We have to be talking to constituents, and we have to be talking to those who are closest to the issue, because those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solutions.
Absolutely.
And that is something that I've learned from day one. And so just as an example, because I think it's good to give a concrete example,
Yes.
there have been many times where I've been approached about a piece of legislation that would essentially increase penalties for individuals who are trafficking a low number of guns into our city. And we already have a law in the books that does impose criminal penalties on traffickers for 5 or more guns. And there is no evidence, none of the data shows that increasing a penalty would actually have any deterrence effect on the individuals who are trafficking, and that it would have a disproportionate impact on Black and brown folks and lead to more incarceration. And more incarceration has not been shown to actually reduce gun violence or create more just and safe communities. And so we have not endorsed that bill, and we will not endorse that bill. And on the whole, we do not rubber stamp any bill that just simply because it's called a solution to reducing gun violence doesn't necessarily have the evidence to back that up. So, and that is something that I would not necessarily have dug as deeply into had it not been for an initial conversation that I had with Shayna. And so I would recommend that all state groups and all organizations that are working on policy use that as a template before making their determinations as to what it is that they're going to back and what it is that they're going to endorse.
Yeah, and I could not agree more. And I also think that, one of the reasons why we started this program is because to grow strategically and to be able to take the time to understand the racial inequities in policy and unintended consequences, that takes capacity. And I think what you all are being able to achieve through your programming and through your advocacy work is so incredibly admirable. And I'm just thinking, if you could grow if state groups, were given the capacity and provided, the funding. Our movement would be limitless. Right now, our movement on the state level is predicated by small, under-resourced organizations, and just seeing what you all have put together over the years on a small budget and a small team, it's really, really commendable. And I would love it, actually, Shane, if you could go into that a little bit, and really kind of take us into the reaction program and take us through what this program is and what you've been able to accomplish.
Absolutely, thank you. So Reaction, like I said, is our signature program. It's a year-long curriculum. It's delivered in New York City schools, and students come from Black and Brown communities most affected by gun violence. I think the great thing about the particular program is that it's a 4-credit program. So we are working with side by side with other health teachers, history teachers, to roll out this curriculum. So every single student who, is in the school, who signed up for a health class or English class, or history class, will get a part of this curriculum. And I think that truly changes, when we talk about young people who are locked in and doing the work, because let's just be honest, the young people who we work with might not necessarily sign up to do gun violence prevention work, right? But they have the answers. They are closest to the problem. So we want to go where they are. It's really, really important to bring this kind of work to where the young folks are. We've grown tremendously working with the Reaction program. Like, we've reached over 1,000 students have been reached from this in this program. In the last year, we've grown 66%. We've been able to work in almost 17 new schools during COVID, and it's really because we've been able to switch our program from being in school to remote, which has been amazing for us because we've been able to do this work over the internet. The problem is we're going back into the schools this school year, and because of, like we talked a little bit about, the limited staff that we have, we're going to have to be in person, and it's really hard for us to continue to reach that amount of schools when we have to be in person that way. So when we talk about why it's important to fund programs like Reaction, this is really what it is. There's such a high demand for a program like this. But just to talk a little bit more about what the program actually looks like, it's broken up into 4 different parts. It's personal development, group development, education, and advocacy. And it really runs in a way where young people have an opportunity to really talk about their own lived experiences with gun violence, and then really figure out why gun violence happens in their communities, where these guns are coming from, why are young people picking up the guns, right? And then they kind of gradually move to a place where they really try, we really sit down and we discuss toxic masculinity. We really sit down and we discuss this idea of powerlessness and fear. And those, I think, those are the things that young people they don't necessarily have the opportunity to have conversations around. And then once we, have those kinds of conversations, young people start to feel really, really empowered about the things that they're learning. And then, they're figuring out where these guns are coming from. They are changing their mindsets around picking up a gun. And this idea that guns make you feel powerful. And I'm gonna be honest with you guys, they become really angry about the fact that it's easier for them to find a gun than it is for them to get a library card in their community. And they want to know, why is this happening? Why are the guns that are found in my community not from my community, but actually coming from other places where they don't have as much gun violence? And those kinds of things really make them want to advocate for stricter gun laws and for more opportunities in their spaces. And they learn about who represents them. They learn how to speak to elected officials, how to contact elected officials. We have an opportunity to take them to actually speak with their elected officials, whether it's in the district offices or in Washington. And they sit down and they talk about those recommendations, the same kind of recommendations that I had an opportunity to create when I was 19 years old. So it's really about allowing young people to be advocates for themselves, because they know they know the solutions. They know what they need to feel empowered. They know what they need to feel protected. So we are just creating platforms for young people to be able to do that. In addition to the Reaction program, we have other really great education programs. I know we have annual advocacy up here too, but I do want to talk a little bit more about the Miller mentorship. What we've seen over the years is that the young folks who are in our reaction program, they absolutely love it. Their their attendance rates goes up. Their grades go up as they are in the program. And then the summertime happens and it's like, see you guys next September. And unfortunately, a lot of the young people we work with, they don't have safe summers and they want to do something. They want to continue to do this work. So we've been able to create a Miller mentorship. Each summer, we work with the same young folks from our reaction program. We kind of connect them to other young folks who have been doing this work a little bit longer, and they could continue to do more of an intensive. And during the summer, they create other initiatives. And it's been really, really a really great resource for young people, especially during, COVID, when so much, destruction has happened for a lot of the young people that we've worked with. So it's really been an outlet for the folks.
This is really amazing, Shana and Rebecca. And it's interesting, Shana, because you were talking about the fact that there still are these illegal guns that get to the street, right? So Senator Blumenthal mentioned the iron pipeline, and for those who are watching, the iron pipeline is a term for the illegal guns that are trafficked from states with looser laws. So the iron pipeline of firearms. And so, as we talk about the importance of state laws, there is the importance of federal and national laws, because, New York is not an island, where I live in Maryland is not an island. And so we can have strong laws, but, we're only as strong as the states surrounding us and the states where these guns can come in. And the other piece with the federals, we talk about, this connection and this cycle, are the funding streams that President Biden and the House Appropriations is attempting to pass, especially to support community violence intervention programs. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the funding that could potentially be available for community violence programs, and how New Yorkers Against Gun Violence is supporting these programs, engaging with the programs to be able to strengthen what you're doing, but also to be able to strengthen the movement in New York itself.
So I can speak to that first, and then Shana, of course, if you want to supplement, please do. So we're sort of working at all levels of this, right? So we were, as I said, we were involved in advocating for more funding as a part of our legislative work, as a part of the New York State budget advocacy work that we did. But we also work very closely with Cure Violence and community-based organizations on the ground. We consider ourselves one in a lot of ways, because we're working in the schools and we're working in the communities with young people and their families. But we also understand that the street intervention work that's being done by Cure Violence organizations is essential to really mediating and interrupting the violence right before it happens in hotspots in the most affected areas. And so what we've done in the last 2 years is we've actually been collaborating with the 34 CBOs on the ground in New York City to train school conflict mediators and Cure Violence interrupters on our curriculum. And what we're working on now is to continue those trainings so that not only are individuals potentially able to use our curriculum in some way with the youth that they interact with in their schools, but also as a way of creating spaces to have those conversations with adults as well, who have been traumatized by gun violence, who are formerly incarcerated and need more wraparound services to be able to have these conversations and also feel empowered to be advocates themselves. And I think what we're seeing is more and more of that, right? Like, we are seeing more and more of leadership from community-based organizations in Washington doing the advocacy themselves as they should be, because those individuals are the ones that know what works, what doesn't work, and should be instrumental in helping with implementation and creating the infrastructure for what agencies should look like in order to continue to push out those funding streams, and what is needed organizationally and capacity-wise to continue to do this work in an effective way, because hopefully there will be more and more. And I can tell you that what's happening at the state level right now is that not only is the federal funding potentially going to be channeled through city agencies and state agencies, but also that has inspired states and municipalities to allocate more funding too. And so, for example, right now there's a request for proposal that's being put out at the state level for street intervention workers to be able to increase their capacity, and also for social services that work on gun violence prevention work to increase their capacity. So we're working on the ground. We're working, on advocacy for these resources, and we also want to help with the education training in order to make implementation as successful as possible.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rebecca. We are going to start to get into the Q&A portion. So for those of you who are watching us this evening, if you have not put questions in the Q&A and you would like to ask a question to Rebecca and Shana, please do so. I have access to those questions and I'm happy to help facilitate that. And while those of you are putting your Q&A, Shana, I want to dig back into the idea that you were talking about expanding and scaling reaction. What do you see as some of the biggest hurdles to being able to grow and expand the reaction program?
Yeah, thank you. I think some of the biggest hurdles that we've seen trying to expand the reaction program, like Rebecca's just stated, we've, have kind of like rolled out this idea of training other, individuals who work in the community to, roll out the reaction program. Because obviously it takes a certain kind of person who can teach the reaction program. The person has to, not necessarily has to come from the community, but has to understand the lived experiences of the students who are participating in the program. So for us, it has a lot to do with personnel, right? To make sure that you have the right group of people who can roll out a curriculum like ours, right? But in addition, understanding that, this is a large job, right? So a lot of times people they think that this might be like an after school program, and it's not. It's a full on full year curriculum, and it definitely takes an instructor to really kind of like pull the weight to do that. So each school pretty much would need like a reaction instructor to do that, and that just takes money. It takes money. The demand is there. Every single high school, every single middle school that we've worked in since we rolled out the reaction program has asked us to come back, right?
Wow.
But unfortunately, the spaces that need a reaction program the most don't necessarily have the funds to have a reaction program, right? They have to take the funds to get computers for students, or they might have to take the funds to get new books, right? So we're working in spaces where there's not a large amount of money to do this work, right? It just aren't. So for us, it's really about trying to figure out how to scale this in a way to make sure that it's in the spaces that it needs to be, and finding the money to do so. I think, Rebecca, you could definitely add to that, but I just think that it's important for us to remember that you just can't teach anyone how to do this, right? It has to be a person who understands the lived experiences of young folks, and it also has to be in a space where it's really, really needed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can definitely add to that and be even more, direct about it, which is that we just have a limited amount of money. And I think it's important for people on this particular, call to understand that we have a large budget for a state group, but it's still less than $1 million. Our operating budget is $600,000, and we have 8 staff members, only 4 of whom are full-time, and that's an increase from 3 just in the last 6 months. And we do real work that requires a lot of time and skills, and it's not something that you can just hire someone and they can go off into the field. It requires training. One of the things that we have strategically done.
And I don't want to cut you off, but I just want to
cut me off. Go ahead. It's okay.
We have 3 instructors, and we're working in 18 schools. And when we say 18 schools, I mean like 5 classes a day, working with like what would we say? 90 to 100 students a day per instructor. So this is a large impact with such a small group of people.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted
to
yeah.
And so just to expand on that, and I think it might be a good segue into talking about some of the partnership work that we're doing together, Jen, is that we've thought about, okay, we know that reaction is really personnel heavy and requires a lot of time and focus. And so we've been working on trying to expand that and scale that in New York City, while also being mindful of the fact that our what we're doing in our work is really needed in other cities and communities across the state. So what can we do with our limited capacity to, in a quality way, expand our presence in a way that's actually impactful? And so that's why we're launching our Connecting Communities initiative, so that we can do more of the statewide education and have a presence in a place like Rochester or Syracuse or Buffalo, which isn't around the corner from New York City. New York State is a big state, and really, we have been able to leverage the virtual platforms in order to be able to stay in touch with people and organize in that way. But we really need to have relationships with people on the ground, because you cannot authentically represent the issues that are happening unless you actually are talking to people locally. And so this Connecting Communities initiative will not only allow us to work with and organize local folks to do advocacy work, but it will also allow us to have forums to bring together individuals who are doing the work on the ground in cities, where the cities are most impacted, and to educate folks about the solutions that are working who do not live in the cities. And I think that this is a really important piece of the public education work that we do, because we are at this pivotal point where even if people can agree that we need more public safety and the gun violence is a problem and we need fewer guns, the direction in which we go to actually accomplish that goal could look very different, right? It could mean increasing penalties, it could mean in more jail time, it could mean increasing policing, and it's essential for us to be able to educate on the nuance of that and make sure that the policies that we are supporting are represented and communicated by the folks who are actually doing the work, who know what's working and what doesn't.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. That's really exciting. I can't wait to see more from both Reaction and Connecting Communities. So I have a question for one of our participants. So thank you everyone who is watching. Gun violence is connected to many other public health issues and racial justice issues. How does New Yorkers Against Gun Violence view the issue of police violence and police reform as it relates to gun violence prevention? And how is New Yorkers Against Gun Violence addressing this important issue?
So the answer is quite simple. We believe that unaccountable police violence is gun violence, and that we need to include the reform of our law enforcement system in our work, and that we need to be talking of victims of police violence in the same way that we would be talking to survivors and families and victims of gun violence that's happening in communities or gun violence that's happening in our homes. And we need to talk about the systemic inequities that have led to a law enforcement system that is having this disproportionate impact on people of color, and why there's this distrust between law enforcement and our communities. We need to be talking to the experts who understand what that looks like, and being supportive of new solutions that will create more trust, but also lean more heavily on community-led solutions. I think that there are ways that we can be tapping into the resources and data that law enforcement have without necessarily having law enforcement be the first responders to a gun violence situation, in part because they generally are the responders. They're not necessarily those who prevent the issue. They come after the fact, and that is part of the problem. And there are also circumstances in which law enforcement don't have the training, nor do they want to have the training to be able to intervene when there's an issue that may be a domestic violence issue or a mental health crisis. There are other resources that we can be tapping into to address those solutions. So this is a part of the work that we do. And we're also focusing a lot in the coming year on policing in schools, because we work so closely with our schools, we work so closely with our young people, and we know that lack of training for school resource officers and the presence of police in general in schools is generally counterproductive, and that we need to have more resources that are supportive to our students that take the place of police in schools, like counselors and mental health support and programs like Reaction, so that we don't have to lean on a uniformed police officer to intervene when there's a problem in our schools. No student should walk into any school and feel that they're a criminal from the second that they walk through the door. And so many of our schools are surveilled in that way. They have metal detectors when you walk in. You're patted down, whether or not you, have potentially a record or not. And there's actually a stationed of uniformed police right there in the lobby. And that immediately puts students on notice that not that necessarily that the police are there to protect them, but that the police are there to protect the teachers and administrators from the students. And when you're treated that way at the outset, how is that a safe and supportive space? So we're looking at policy solutions that we can support that will help change that system and help move us in the direction of more safe and supportive schools and communities.
Thanks, Rebecca. We have another question from someone who's watching, and they are really frustrated with the lack of progress on the federal level. And so I'll actually open up this question, to really just federal, state, and community, which is, what are some concrete ways that, folks who are listening to this conversation, watching this conversation, how can they get involved?
So how can they get involved at the state level, or just more general? So first of all, if you live in New York and you want to get involved in our initiatives, one example that I can give is that, yes, you can sign our petitions and you can learn about our policy priorities and you can make your calls, and all of those things are important. But if you live in a community that you think would benefit from one of our education forums, you can help organize that. We really do look for volunteers that want to dig in and roll up their sleeves, and helping us organize, a program, educating folks about the issues and also about our priorities is always helpful, whether it's, in a faith-based space or in a school or community center, or it's virtual. Those are all things that we're looking for on a volunteer basis. I also think that this is a model that can definitely be used in other states. I think that people are looking for meaningful ways to have an impact as a volunteer, and they're sick of making their calls over and over again and signing the same petition, especially at the federal level. And so look at what's happening in your own backyard, get involved in the politics of what's happening in your own backyard, find out what the positions of your lawmakers in your municipality or at your state level have on gun violence prevention measures, and vote accordingly, but also get involved in the education side of things, because we can't really make change at the policy level until there's a critical mass of folks on the ground that agree that this is something that matters. And that's where the public education piece of it comes in. Shana, if you want to add in on that.
I just want to piggyback off of what you said, and I just really want to talk directly to members of the community to understand how important it is to advocate for legislation that will reduce gun violence in your community. As a person who's been doing this for a long time, especially working in communities where people don't necessarily trust laws, right? They don't trust that creating, or advocating for legislation is going to actually reduce the gun violence that's happening in the Bronx, what's happening in Brooklyn, right? They don't see it. I want to be the one to tell you today that it does. It absolutely does, right? And the more you know about the legislation that's happening, the more you research, the more you understand who represents you, where your elected officials are, the more influence you will actually have. So I just want to encourage you to, call your elected officials, encourage you to understand that you don't necessarily have to advocate for a bill that has the word gun in it. There's so many other legislation that's out there that can reduce gun violence. I know so many people right now are advocating for safe housing or healthy foods. All those things can reduce gun violence, right? When we talk about young people or people in general feeling powerless in your community, these are some of the things that make them feel powerless. The happier you are, the safer the place that you live feels, right? The more you feel like your life is worth living, right? And that changes, the idea that I might have to pick up a gun or I have to protect myself. All of those things actually makes your community safer. So I just want you guys to all be encouraged to continue to do this work and understand that you, honestly, until you advocate for this legislation for people who live in the communities that are disproportionately affected by gun violence, it's not going to work. We have to all do it together.
And Jen, I just wanted to add one more thing to what Shana just said, which is that and it's a perfect segue to this, which is that educating the community and constituents about the intersections between, for example, housing and gun violence is a part of our work too. Shayna just worked very closely with the New York City Department of Health, because the New York City Department of Health had done all of this research and created a data story that you can find on their website about how redlining has had an impact on the communities that are most affected by gun violence and how those two issues intersect. So we created a whole curriculum for our youth and for the community about the intersection between redlining, housing issues, and gun violence. And that will hopefully allow us to then lead into, okay, what are some policy issues that we can at least work in coalition with in the housing space and support that may actually have an impact on creating safer communities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think that, this is a really positive way, to kind of end the conversation on, some of the great ways that folks can get involved and the change that can be made. But before I kind of could just give a brief closing, because I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. We said this would be an hour. I always try to keep to that. What is something that most people miss about state and community level organizing and advocacy that you think that it's important for our listeners right now to hear?
So I think that, I think that frequently what is missed is that we're the ones that are closest to the community, and we're also the ones that have the relationships with legislators within the community and also in Albany, or at your state capital. I think that, understandably, national organizations have a lot of funding, they're well known, and they have the ability to reach lots of people, and that's very, very important. But there's also a really important space for organizations, community-led organizations and state organizations that only focus on the state that they're in or the community that they're in. And there's room for all of us. But I think that one of the things that is so special about the Safer States Initiative and the work that we're doing with Coalition to Stop Gun Violence is that a national organization is recognizing that there already exist these relationships and organizations on the ground, and how can they be supportive and create that deeper bench of policy expertise and infrastructure while also uplifting the leadership that's already doing the work. And I think that's an excellent model, not only because we're obviously going to benefit from it, but also because there's no reason to reinvent the wheel, and because it's more effective. And I think that, Jen and I can speak to this certainly with respect to microstamping. Like, we've already been in there, we've already been able to talk to, those who are carrying the bills and have access to the inventor, for example, and did a briefing this past session for the Senate Codes Committee. And so we kind of got a head start on that. And those things only happen because of the relationships that are already existing on the ground. So I hope that that helps answer your question, but I really think that this model of a national organization working with organizations that are already existing locally is the way to go.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have, and it is unfortunate because I just feel like I could talk to the both of you all night. I really want to thank our special guest, Senator Blumenthal, for delivering our opening remarks and reminding us that supporting states across the country is the path to progress. I would deeply like to thank our two very special guests, Rebecca and Shayna, for a substantial and inspiring discussions. We are just so grateful for you for attending and for your interest, everyone who's participating tonight and watching tonight, in trying to make America safer state by state. Here at the Coalition, we deeply believe in the collective power of a combined grassroots call to action. By unifying our voices, we are going to make change. And another way to affect change for all of you is, we've talked a lot about resources tonight, and we're hoping that some of you will be able to actually invest in this important work. The anonymous donor who is helping fund the Safer States Initiative is actually offering us a match to all gifts to the initiative up to $1 million. So that means if we raise $1 million, we get a second $1 million to be able to expand deeper into New York and expand to other states across the nation. So we invite everyone here to be able to make a gift to the Safer States Initiative. It's going to save lives. There should be a link in the chat so that all of you can gain access to that. And then we'll follow up to share more information about how you can contribute to this matching challenge. So your gift will unlock additional funds to save lives. So thank you to Rebecca and Shana. Thank you everyone who attended this evening to learn how we can all make a difference to end gun violence and how the state level work is such an important part of ensuring that we actually succeed at the state level, but also at the national level. So best wishes to everyone, and I hope you all stay healthy and safe. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much for having us, Jen. Thank you.
Yeah.